All right. Well, it's 7:33, and for the sake of being at least somewhat timely, I think I'll get this evening's presentation going. I wasn't expecting a record crowd tonight, given that we have a highly specialized topic that we're going to be drilling into that I trust will be of interest to all of you. For you practicing foresters, may not have as much relevancy if you don't have forest up in the snow zone up above 2,500 feet or so. But tonight's topic, a really interesting research project that NNRG has embarked on. As you may or may not know, the Northwest Natural Resource Group is the forester for the Nisqually Community Forest. And the Nisqually Community Forest over the years has grown to about a 4,000 acre community owned and managed forest up in the foothills of the Cascade near Ashford, Washington. And I'm on the board of directors, and our staff have been managing the forest up there for the past several years. And a couple of years ago, we got a grant through the Wildlife Conservation Society to test out a number of different climate adaptation strategies. And two of those involved pre-commercially thinning young stands to different densities. And this is a long-term study to look at density management in the face of climate change and how managing forests at different densities affect forest growth. And the second study, which will be the subject of our conversation tonight, was cutting in what we call snow gaps. These are small patch cuts within the forest that are intended to accumulate snow and retain snow later into the season. So we put these in last year, had our first winter of monitoring and have our first results back. And in fact, we've published our first findings about this project. And that's on our website right now. And I'll ask Alex to post that in the chat function so you can take a look at that. But I'm really pleased to have as our presenter tonight our very own Rowan Braybrook. Rowan is the director of programs for the Northwest Natural Resource Group and has been instrumental in a lot of the research projects that we've worked on, both on the economics of uneven age forest management, and more recently now on over the past few years on our various climate adaptation strategies. And Rowan and Alex in particular have worked very closely together to put together a lot of resources on our website and to produce a number of publications about climate adaptation strategies. And so you can go to our website. We have a whole page that's dedicated to information on climate adaptation. And you can find that, and Alex will post that in the chat function also, so you can look for both of those. But tonight, again, Rowan is joining us, and she's going to talk about the specifically the snow gap study that we've done. And at the tail end of that, I'll talk a little more broadly about some of the other climate adaptation strategies that we have applied at the Nisqually Community Forest. And then after that, we'll open it up to general discussion. So even though tonight is really specifically about these snow gaps, which again are really only relevant, obviously, if you're up in the snow zone, the overall topic being climate adaptation, we're happy to talk about any questions you have, any insights you have into how to manage Northwest forests for increased resilience in the face of climate change. So certainly welcome your input. And usually the format of these fireside chats is the first half hour is presentation. The second half hour, we open up for general discussion. So really look forward to sharing a conversation with you all. Looks like we're getting a few more folks signing in. So I'm glad that I've bought a little bit of time here before getting started on the meat of the matter. But I think with that, again, check the chat function there for some information links, and we'll continue to add to that. One other bit of logistics, that if any questions come up over the course of Rowan's presentation at the beginning, you can go ahead and type those into the chat function. And at the end of the presentation, Alex will go through those, filter them out, and present or pose some of the questions to Rowan or potentially myself. And we'll take those questions first before we open up to a more general public discussion. So with that, I would like to introduce Rowan Braybrook, again, our Director of Programs. And thanks, Rowan, for joining us this evening and talking a bit about the snow gap study that we've been doing.
Yeah, thanks, Kirk. It's nice to be joining the Fireside chat, even without the Fireside. As I mentioned, for those folks who were coming in early, rather than huddling around a fire, I'm huddling around my air purifier all day today. So I think we'll wait at least another month until we have fires indoors, since we have enough fires outdoors right now. But it is a very timely discussion for climate adaptation for just that reason. So I'm excited to be sharing one of our projects with you today. And of course, I just get to be the messenger for this interesting project. A lot of our forestry team are the folks who were up there doing most of the monitoring throughout the winter, while I was nice and cozy with a fireside. So definitely hat tip to all of our fabulous forestry team who have been out up in Nisqually Community Forest. So this isn't really a adaptation 101 discussion, but I did want to let you know, as Kirk mentioned, that we do have a lot of resources. So if you are wanting to dig into climate adaptation a little bit more broadly, we do have a lot of resources on our website that we've developed in response to feedback from various landowners and forest stewards. So we have a lot of resources on our webpage at nnrg.org/climate adaptation, and we will continue updating with all of the interesting things that we find from this and other projects that we're doing around the Puget Sound area. So of course, one of the reasons why we're talking about climate adaptation and how we can address it is exactly for some of the reasons why those little mountains look so stressed. We're seeing already in our forests a lot of summer drought, which I think everyone can attest to that. It's been about 4 or 5 months since we've seen any significant precipitation here in the Northwest. There's less snow, and which of course leads to more unpredictable water supply in certain areas that relies on snowfall for their water supply, and more intense wildfires, which leads to my eyes burning and a headache every morning when I wake up. So we are definitely feeling some of those impacts of climate change already. So even though we know the worst impacts of climate change are going to be in the future, of course, the trees that we plant now are the trees that are going to be with us 20 and 30 years in the future, when we are feeling even more severe impacts from a weirding climate. So we're really looking to build climate resilience into the system, and especially with a system like forests, you have that positive, in a good way, positive feedback loop of having adapted forests that can then also help mitigate further climate change with the carbon sequestration. So it's an ecosystem that definitely keeps on giving, and we want to give it as good of a chance as possible. So some of the common approaches that we already take and already recommend for increasing climate resilience includes monitoring, adaptive management of forests, managing for lower densities, especially in those forests that are former plantations, which of course we see a lot in formerly clear-cut areas in the Pacific Northwest, and increasing plant diversity so that it's not kind of that monoculture of all Douglas fir, but you have different species that might have different adaptation responses to a changing climate. The project that we're talking about today is specifically around snowfall and mid-elevation snowfall, which, as Kirk mentioned, is a pretty specific topic of conversation, but it is really interesting and really relevant more generally to all of us who are living in the Northwest and might be concerned about, long-term water supplies and how people who manage watersheds might be responding to some of these impacts. So we've been working with the Nisqually Community Forest to test some of these techniques that have been suggested in the past. So really what we're doing with our partners up near Mount Rainier, which you can see beautiful Mount Rainier in the background of that lower picture, is to see if some of these practical forestry techniques that we recommend can actually increase the snowpack and slow that snow melt in the spring to increase water availability. So this whole area of the Nisqually Community Forest is within the watershed. It feeds into streams, that feeds into rivers, that feed into the water supply for several different cities, including Eatonville up near Mount Rainier. And we're looking at what forestry techniques can increase how much precipitation is available throughout the winter in the form of snowfall, and then also throughout the spring, how can you create more predictable melting effects into the stream, bringing that cooler, clearer water into the stream later into the spring, to have a more predictable melt into the watershed. So there are three main activities that we're implementing with this project, and that we're monitoring over time to see how they impact that snowpack and the snow melt in the spring. One is to thin the forest. If you have been to these fireside chats before, I'm sure that you've heard this as a recommendation. A lot of the forests that we're working with are former plantations that are really densely planted with a single species, and thinning the forest and taking out some of that density spreads the available soil moisture among the remaining trees. So with a drier projected future climate and drier current climate this month especially, it's really, the idea is allowing the remaining water to be spread among fewer remaining trees, to give those remaining trees a better chance to grow larger, to grow more resilient, to have even deeper roots, and be able to better withstand what Mother Nature and the changing climate throws at it in the future. The second, which is a little bit more unusual that we haven't talked about as much, is installing snow gaps. So those are small cuts of about half an acre to an acre, which you can see some of those here. The idea between those snow gaps, which is a little bit more commonly used in watershed areas, or at least more commonly recommended, is that more snow accumulates in those gaps, and then it extends the snow melt season, like we were mentioning. So one of the key things that we're looking for in this project is, with those snow gaps versus the thinned forest, are we still capturing more snow in that thinned forest and slowing that melt? And if so, is there an ideal density that we might be able to recommend where you can still keep a lot of those trees and still have a lot of that snow accumulation? Is there a nice balance that we can strike in order to have the best of both worlds? Or are the snow gaps really so much more impactful in terms of the amount of moisture they're able to retain that they should be the recommendation going forward? So that was one of the questions that we were looking at in this research implementation. And then another part of the project overall is that we are planting seedlings from warmer zones, where we're wanting to provide a local source within the forest for seeds and seedlings to be present and have more genetic diversity within that forest, so that over time it's providing a local source of more adapted genetics for a more diversity of species. And in the 20-30 year timeline, we have then a local genetic source for different types of trees. So what we did this last winter, and what we will continue to do this next winter, is taking snow measurements across these areas where we did the thinning and the snow gaps. So most of these measurements, we had a number of different measurements that we were taking, but the two that we'll be focusing on today are the snowpack depth that our techs and foresters were taking across the transect. You can see the wonderful graphic design job I did across this photo of what the transect looked like. And then also changing the snow depth by camera. And I have a couple of pictures of what that looks like, but essentially we were looking at the snow depth over time in two different ways. One, through walking through the forest along a transect, using a snow probe to stab the snow and say, all right, how deep is this right here, and record that measurement. And that happened every other week during the snow accumulation phase, and then every week during the ablation phase. And ablation is just a fancy word for melting snow. And then the camera twice a day would take a picture of the snow depth looking at a measurement rod, using those wildlife cameras, and then we would take the image and determine what the snow depth was on that day. So based on those measurements, here's a little bit of a clearer picture of what the site looked like. Over here is the unthinned area, which we were calling the control area. So that is the really heavy density plantation forest. Over here we have the thinned area where we retained a number of the trees, but did take out some of the stock to relieve some of that density. And then through the small gap cut here where we will eventually be replanting with trees and trees that are adapted to somewhat drier climates. This picture here gives you an idea of the original forest that we were working with, very densely packed, uniform type formation. I'm sure a lot of you recognize exactly what type of forest this is. It's all over the place in the Northwest, and you know, that's a question we come up against frequently, is what can we do to put this on a better trajectory for the future? So these are our technicians and our intern going out and either prepping or taking the measurements. So we had these wildlife cameras up in trees that were turned facing some of these measurement rods. And they would take 2 pictures per day throughout the winter to see what snow depth was along these rods. And then throughout the winter, we had folks going out and taking measurements of the snow to see how deep the snowpack is along that transect that I pointed out earlier with my graphic design skills. So these are some of the results. The kind of very short top line answer is that the snow gaps were working really well, even before the spring snows. But the thinned areas showed a marked improvement over the controlled, densely packed areas. So what you're seeing on these graphs on the bottom, and what you'll see even better in the next graph, is the change in the snow depth over the course of the winter. So on the right-hand side is the control area, which is the unthinned forest. And you can see here the snow accumulating and then melting to about nothing. And this was just through March. So this was like the first portion of winter. In the thinned area, you can see it accumulated and melted, but more slowly. So at the end, you're still seeing more snow than in the control unthinned area. And then in the gap, there's considerably more snow still present and maintained over time. So if we're looking at the winter as a whole, this is what it looks like through June of this year. We had that initial big accumulation of snow right around the new year. I'm sure all of you remember that great snow we had right after Christmas that stuck around for a surprisingly long time. And then that slow initial melt of the snow till almost nothing in some of the control areas, but we did maintain snow in both the gapped and the thinned areas. And then another accumulation of snow in March and April. I'm sure everyone remembers the surprise snow that we got in the spring. and then another ablation phase. And throughout all of the winter, you can see very consistently, with great and surprising consistency even, the gaps consistently have the most snow and the slowest melt, but the thinned areas were consistently great in accumulating snow and slowing the melt much more than the unthinned control areas. Now, taking that same information and looking at it through the transects, here what we're looking at is our technicians going out on these select dates that were kind of representative overall of the data that they found, walking through the thinned area and taking measurements of the thinned area, walking through the gap cut and taking measurements of the gap cut, and then walking through the control area and taking snow measurements of the control. So you can see in the first 2 dates, there was still snow. I guess so. These were the 2 snow after both snows. So that was the snow in the middle of winter, and then that snow in April. So the control had snow on both of those dates, but then it melted relatively quickly. Over in the thinned area, there was a lot more snow that accumulated, and it was slower to melt. So it did melt all of the snow by early June, when the gap cut did still have some snow, but it retained snow throughout into the middle of May. So even though there was still some snow left in that gap cut all the way into June, the thinned area did remarkably well to keeping that snow until just a few weeks ahead of the gap cut. Now, I mentioned planting. So we are taking seedlings from lower elevation and southerly areas and planting them in some of these gap cuts. We've already planted some of the seedlings, but a lot of them, due to snow and availability, we did have to heel in, and I'll show you what that looks like in another slide, in order to wait for this fall. So once the long-awaited rains start again, we'll be planting those seedlings in those gap cuts and monitoring them over time as well. In order to protect the seedlings so that we can get some good monitoring results, we did want to frustrate the deer, so we are protecting them, and that will allow us to keep an eye on them over time, similar to our Stossel Creek adaptation project, which, for those of you who might be interested in assisted migration as a topic, that could be another good study to look into. And then I mentioned some of the seedlings were heeled in. So these are our seedlings that are waiting to be planted this fall once the rains start. We actually just had a bit of a tagging party last week where we tagged a bunch of the Douglas firs with where they were from, whether they were from, Skagit County or Kitsap County or down south in Northern Oregon, to see over time which of those seedlings are going to grow the best based on where they were sourced from. We're really wanting to use these results to help us grow our understanding and also share it with partners. So we are working with a couple of different partners to explore the results further and also help us adjust our monitoring to make sure that we're getting the most informative results possible. So we are working with the University of Washington on some of the results, and also with some wonderful interns that have been volunteering their time and research expertise. We've been in touch with the Forest Service to include this information in some of the meta-analyses of assisted migration trials that are ongoing. And we are planning to continue this measurement for at least several years to keep track of how the forest changes over time. And we're also spreading the message among partners and other interested professional groups. So we're going to be presenting some of this information next week at the National Adaptation Forum. So I am looking forward to that. And if anyone's going to be there, happy to meet up in Baltimore. With that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Kirk for a couple of more slides talking about watershed hydrology.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. So big effort at the Nisqually Community Forest is looking at how to manage these former industrial plantations that we've acquired to improve watershed hydrology. Obviously, that was the impetus behind the snow gaps. Can we implement different silvicultural strategies that hold moisture higher in the watershed later into the season? One of the other silvicultural strategies that we're implementing, although this will be on a very, very long time scale, is extended rotation ages. So arguably or demonstrably, industrial timber rotations occur on about a 40-year rotation. Trees are growing at 40 years, harvested, replanted, growing at 40 years, harvested, replanted, etc. And we've become very interested in the ecological values of older forests. And one of the points of inspiration behind this is some work that Bob McCain at the EPA has done on modeling the watershed hydrology benefits of older forests. And drawing both from his research and other research, one of the things that we've come to understand is that older forests do in fact have a much better effect on watershed hydrology. And that is comes down to the fact that young, vigorously growing forests transpire significantly more moisture from the soil than older forests. So part of our interest at the Nisqually Community Forest is to improve watershed hydrology for downstream salmon habitat. We feel that it behooves us to begin looking at how to grow older forests and retain older forests in the watershed. Go ahead, Rowan, if you can advance it. This slide comes directly out of some of the modeling that Bob McCain did, again, with the EPA, in specifically looking at the Mayshell watershed, of which the Nisqually Community Forest is at the headwaters. And in some of the preliminary modeling, it's showing that older forests can have a benefit to late summer stream flow to the tune of 4 or 5 times stream flow than business as usual or short rotation forestry. Go ahead, Rowan. We also know that there's a lot of other ecosystem benefits to older forests than just improved watershed hydrology. And our executive director, Seth Zuckerman, and our lead forester, Joel Mann, did sort of a thought exercise and some additional modeling on the benefits of older forests to both carbon sequestration and the production of timber. And they modeled again, or compared several short rotation harvests over a 100-year time frame to a longer, say, 80-year rotation, and discovered through this modeling, or more so verified, this is already established science, that extended rotations produce both more timber over the same time frame as compared to short rotation, as well as sequester significantly more carbon. If you're interested in the background of this and want to read more about it, Alex just posted a link to the article that Seth wrote on our website. So I am glazing over this right now, more so just presenting this as food for thought, and you can dig into some of the background of this on your own. Rowan, I can't remember if I have another slide or not. Nope, I don't. Okay. One other thing that I just wanted to add to Rowan's talk about the snow gaps is, and I'm sure some people are going to be curious about this, relative to the seedlings that we planted up. The Rowan mentioned that we chose the seed stock from different climates, lower elevation and different areas around Washington. Just to add a little more nuance to that, we used a Forest Service tool that's available to everybody called the Seed Lot Selection Tool. And if you aren't familiar with that, you can Google the Seed Lot Selection Tool. And what this online tool allows you to do is enter the location of a particular forest and then run a model to see what climate currently, or what area of the Northwest currently has the climate that your forest will have, say 60, 80 years in the future. And this allows you then to look for seed stock from those particular areas. So when we ran this model for the Nisqually Community Forest, it told us that, for instance, and this helped us in our purchasing of Douglas fir seed stock, that comparable climatic zones right now, again, are going to be at lower elevations, since the Nisqually Community Forest is at a 25 to 3,500 foot elevation. But that current lower elevations in the area of the Toutle River, the lower Columbia River, Kitsap County, and Skagit County have climates that we expect the high elevation Nisqually Community Forest to have, again, 60, 80 years in the future. So we chose seed stock for Douglas fir from those areas. Western red cedar, we also planted that up in the snow gaps and chose cedar that came from a lower elevation seed zone. The assumption is that with climate change, that the lower elevation climate is going to begin creeping up into the higher elevation areas. Then we also planted white pine and western hemlock, and those two species just have statewide seed zones. There are not, at least from the nurseries that we purchased them from, didn't have more specific seed zones. So those were the four species that we planted up there. Again, Douglas fir, western red cedar, white pine, and western hemlock. We also expect, of course, to get a very high rate of natural regeneration of the true firs that occur up there, the grand fir, noble fir, silver fir, and there also is Douglas fir in that area that will likely seed into those gaps. So just adding a little bit more. So with that, I think we'll take a look at the chats. I know some questions came in directly to me, and Alex, I'm not sure if you see any. Okay, well, some really great kind of clarifying questions came in. Most of these from Phil North. So Phil, thank you for paying such close attention and helping add a little more detail. So one of the questions was, well, why plant trees in the gaps? And Phil likely is familiar with the regenerative capacity of high elevation true firs, that if you clear any ground, it'll become quickly colonized by native seed of the true firs. They're prolific natural regenerators. So a few reasons that we planted the gaps, and these may have already kind of come up now in the additional explanation that I provided, but one is to get, again, seed stock up there that is adapted to what we expect to be the future climate, to run that kind of experiment up there. The second is to add more biodiversity. These high elevation forests that we acquired were set up as industrial plantations. So they're very homogeneous in age distribution as well as species composition. So by, in particular, adding cedar, white pine, and to a lesser degree hemlock, we're increasing the species diversity across the, well, in this test area anyway, so far at the Nisqually Community Forest. Then Phil also asked, any chance you monitored groundwater in each of the treatments? No, we thought about it, but it's incredibly difficult and expensive to monitor groundwater. That may be something we'll add in the future, since we do basically own the entire upper watershed of the Busy Wild, or the South Fork Busy Wild. That is something we could do. We could put in some in-stream monitors, but that was a little bit beyond the scope of our project so far. Then another question was, did you size your gaps according to the height of surrounding trees? And a great question. For folks that have studied gap creation as a way of regenerating trees within otherwise, again, homogeneous plantations, one of the strategies is to size the diameter of your gap to at least the same height of either surrounding trees or the site potential of the surrounding trees. In our case, we weren't quite that, I'd say, deliberate with the gap sizes. I'd say it was probably a little more arbitrary, and we are putting in both quarter-acre, half-acre, and 1 acre gaps. But your point is a good one, and I will bring that back to our forestry team, that we may want to try some gaps based on either existing tree height or site potential tree height up in that area. Then another question came in: how do you measure forest transpiration? To be honest, that's beyond me to answer. I wish I could explain that, not being the research scientist behind this particular study. And we were not looking at transpiration of the forest in the study. It more so was ablation, or the melting, transpiration, I guess, if you will, of the snow up there. But actually, and if you are interested in knowing more about forest transpiration, the one person I do know that's studying that is Dylan Fisher at the Evergreen State College. He's the head of their forestry program and teaches forest ecosystem studies. And he has a very elaborate forest hydrology and transpiration study going on within the evergreen forestry. He's also looking at, I'm not sure that, I'm sure there's a technical term for it, but internal tree hydrology, if you will, throughout the season. So how do trees take up water, release water, what have you, which is going to have a direct bearing certainly on transpiration. Then one last question: are those rotations, the extended rotations that I mentioned, ending in clear cuts or selected cuts? At this point, and that's a great question. I suppose the technical assumption behind extended rotation is that at some point you are then completing the rotation with a clear cut. When we did the modeling, that was the assumption behind that modeling, that instead of multiple 40-year rotation clear cuts, we're going to extend it to an 80-year rotation clear cut. So that's the basis behind the modeling. Relative to the Nisqually community forest, we're not envisioning a final harvest necessarily up there, but more so putting the forest on a perpetual thinning pathway, where every 20 years or so we'll be coming in and reducing stocking density of the existing cohort. And again, given the high rate of natural regeneration of true firs, we expect to get replenishment or multiple cohorts coming up underneath the current cohort as it continues to mature and we thin it. With the theory being that once we have completed, say, the third or fourth thinning of the existing cohort and reduced it to its final legacy tree stocking, the trees that we will leave there indefinitely, there will be sufficient new cohorts coming online, and we can begin thinning within those, which really then is the basis for uneven age forest management and thinning across multiple cohorts at some point. So I think that's it.
I think a couple more questions came in. Scott asked about the elevation where we were running the experiment. And it's a mid-elevation forest, so average is about 4,000 feet. I think the lowest area of the site is about 3,700 and the highest area is 4,200. And then Philip asked if was the gap shown on the south-facing slope of the mountain? And Kirk, correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's actually was it north-facing?
It is, yeah, north, and somewhat east so far. And to be honest, again, the location of those gaps relative to aspect were somewhat arbitrary. We didn't necessarily choose the location specifically based on aspect, but I anticipate that being a part of future studies. Now that the gaps, we feel if one season, if one data point provides compelling evidence, so far we're feeling compelled to continue this silvicultural strategy into the ongoing timber harvesting that we're doing up at the community forest. We have a 30-year plan up there so far for timber harvesting, and I expect that some degree of these kind of small patch cuts will become integral to our ongoing thinning regime.
And then Scott also asked if we picked a particular shape for the gaps, because it seems like long and thin oriented east-west might protect the snow longer.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I was just reading some of the other comments. I missed that.
For the shape of the gaps, Scott commented that it seemed like long and thin oriented east and west might protect the snow longer. So east-west gaps.
That's a great point. I think you're absolutely right. To be honest, I believe all of our gaps are almost geometrically circular in that they're the easiest to lay out and certainly the easiest to harvest. So yeah, we might get a little more creative with the gap polygon in the future, but I think your point is well made. You're right. I think one of the things that will need to be considerate of when we change the orientation, especially if we go something oblong like that, is the effect of shade on trees that we plant. Since we are planting some species that are only moderately shade tolerant, like the white pine and Douglas fir. But there are ways to arrange plantings also so they get into the right location within these gaps. For instance, planting the more shade-loving species at the north side of the gap so it benefits from southern sunlight, things like that. If anybody has ever worked with a planting crew, though, it's incredibly difficult to get planting crews to plant with a high degree of nuance. So sometimes simpler is better, but anyway. So I think with that, I'd be happy to open it up for more general discussion. I believe people have the ability to unmute themselves, so you don't have to hide in the comfort and anonymity of the chat room, although we've outed everybody who has presented questions. But if anybody has any other, and again, this can be more of a broad discussion about climate adaptation strategies. We don't have to stick just with snow gaps or assisted migration. Are there silvicultural strategies that you're considering or that you've heard of, or ideas that you'd like to bounce off of either Rowan or I or the group here? And don't everybody talk at once. Yeah, Robert.
Would you talk just a little bit about the seed selection and how much difference do you find in say Douglas firs, depending on where they're taken, where they're sourced here in the state of Washington? Because that surprised me. I thought everything would be about the same.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. Well, relative to that, so when you go to purchase conifer seedlings, at least, and this is true for a limited range of hardwoods, depending on the nursery that you go to, I'm not entirely sure which nursery. I'm assuming we bought most of our seedlings from the DNR's Webster nursery. I could be wrong with that, but that's who I purchased a lot of my seedlings from for reforestation. And when you go to the website there and you can choose your seed stock, you'll see that it's based both on elevation and subregion. So it gives you a degree of flexibility. In the past, the premise always was that you should choose seedlings that were derived from a seed stock that of a comparable location to where your forest is. But under the as part of the assisted migration approach, again, now we would be considering a seed stock that are coming from, say, a slightly warmer climate than, or subclimate than, where your property currently is. As far as the growth differences, if that was part of your question, I don't know. We just our very first assisted migration study was actually another project that Rowan worked on, and was this past growing season? It's third or fourth growing season, Rowan?
Third. So
okay.
we haven't analyzed the data yet from the third growing season, but I actually was just working on a poster about the second growing season, which I can show briefly, although it might be a lot of information to share. You're seeing the adaptive forest restoration, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a project that we did at Stossel Creek, which is just to the east of Seattle. And we can share some more information about the project itself, but this information isn't on our blog yet. We found, and I can zoom in a little bit, this is some of the general information about the survival rate and then the vigor rate of different types of trees, and some of the same types of trees from different locations. So we sourced Douglas fir from 3 different locations in California, Oregon, and Washington, and red cedar from both Oregon and Washington, and we're comparing their survival and vigor rates over time. We're only 2 or 3 years out, so some of these survival and vigor rates are related more to species than any differences between the individual seed zones that the seeds originated in. But we do have 6 trial plots that we're watching over time, and we expect over time to see a little bit more divergence. And especially if we see that divergence in multiple trial plots, we think that'll be a really interesting thing to continue tracking. So we can share a bit more information about that, but this particular chart hasn't been released yet because we're still working on it. So a little peek behind the scenes. And then this map that you see is the type of map that was produced by the seed lot selection tool. So this particular model was used with a more extreme climate scenario. So we used a more intense potential future climate scenario to see where seeds could be sourced from in that scenario. And it was showing matches in central to southern Oregon and into northern California. So essentially suggesting these areas as potential sources for seedlings if we wanted to plant with a more extreme climate scenario in mind. But that's a whole nother presentation to get really into the weeds, but I think it's interesting, and certainly happy to continue sharing that information through our website, blog, and newsletter.
I think an interesting observation on that map that you were just showing is that those are areas, a lot of those areas don't have much snow, or rarely have much snow. So.
Right. And I should clarify, so this is for a lower elevation area, so they don't get much snow currently, because this is at Stossel Creek, which is kind of near Duval or Carnation in Washington.
Okay.
But it's kind of similar in terms of the type of sourcing that we were doing.
Right. Okay. One thing I just wanted to ask another question about the planting in the gaps. So is the intention that these stay primarily timber production areas?
It's a good question. They do fall within the working forest zone of the community forest, as we call it. So we've at a landscape level across the roughly 4,000 acres that we're managing now, 6,000 acres with the addition of some Nisqually tribal land. We've broken the whole forest up into 3 different zones based on the kind of silvicultural trajectory that we're managing them on. One is a late cirral zone. So these are areas of high sensitivity that we may come into and do a single thinning and then let natural disturbance be the shaping agent going forward. Another zone, that the largest zone, is the working forest zone, and the intent is to keep them on a perpetual sustainable commercial thinning trajectory. And then we have kind of the in-betweener zone, and these are areas that we're sort of scratching our heads over. They may be steep slopes that we're still determining whether we want to operate on and to what degree, but likely will incorporate, higher structural development and retention, more similar to the late cirral zones, but with maybe 2 or 3 thinning entries, kind of to be decided as we work out the operational logistics on those sites. So to answer your question, yeah, the gaps that we put in there are part of our working forest zone, and presumably at some point, will be harvested for timber. I think it's within our planning window that as these new trees, these new seedlings grow up, we will be pre-commercially thinning them, to, again, improve timber quality and maintain optimal growth for eventual timber production.
Were the Nisqually interested in adding some diversity that adds to their treaty resources?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're
just planting those conifers doesn't do it so much.
I'm sorry, maybe I missed your point. Can you elaborate on that, Phil?
Well, just that adding like broadleaf trees or shrubs, especially if you're up in the snow zone, you could plant huckleberry and have some areas that you could possibly maintain in those cirral stages for the specific tree, just as the Nisqually would do prior to limiting burning.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, with the 2,500 acres that the tribe acquired, we've already been in discussions with them about opening up some of the areas specifically for elk forage and for huckleberry management. So we haven't specifically identified those areas yet, but that will be a change to management on their lands, at least. Whether we incorporate that into the community forest as well, we'll see.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts out there? Observations? Yeah, Robert.
This may be the dumbest question of the night, but I've got a reputation for asking this kind of stuff. If I recall, the snow gap, the snow stayed longer in the areas that had no trees. Is that correct?
Correct.
Why?
Yeah. So the gaps.
Okay,
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, I thought I got that right. That's a whole idea of the presentation, I think. Why?
I think it was, and Rowan, you can correct me if I'm wrong in this, but largely related to accumulation. So there was just significantly more accumulation in the gaps. So it took that much longer for all that snow to melt.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the same amount of snow falls, whether there's trees or not trees, in that, in 4,000 acres. I mean, the snowfall wouldn't differ, but yeah, okay, that would explain it. Just the depth of the snow, it took longer to melt.
Yeah, exactly. It falls, but it doesn't all fall to the ground, of course, because a lot of that's intercepted by the crown, then evaporates. So of the amount that lands, more actually lands in the gaps, and then also more lands in the thinned areas because the canopy isn't completely closed. And then once you have that, it creates insulation for itself and is able to stay later into the spring. That's a big part of it. Yeah.
I would have got that if my brain was engaged tonight, but
I
no,
mean,
good.
it's a late in the evening, so we're happy to help those gears, because we all need a gear
I'm
engagement.
sure somebody else is wondering too. So you just vocalized a question other people probably had.
Well, I
Before
didn't
we
want
lose
people
folks,
going
I did
away
want to
thinking that,
mention.
we should clear cut the forest, to make snow last longer.
Yeah.
That's
And
not
one of
answer either.
the great associated ideas is that even if it's not quite as extreme of a difference with the control versus the gap cut, there is still a very notable and useful difference with thinned areas. So in areas where the forest is thinned, you'll still see that notable difference with the amount of snow that accumulates and the amount of snow that is melting into the spring, even without gap cuts. Kirk, were you about to mention the field tours?
Yes, I did, just before we lost people. And then I also wanted to pivot over to Bob McKing, because I think I might have seen your hand starting to go up there. But yeah, before we lose folks, I want to let people know that we have 2 forestry tours coming up next week on the 26th. We've also partnered with King County and have been working at their Taylor Mountain Forest. Actually, we'll just be getting started, I believe, this week in a suite of pre-commercial thinning projects up there, also aimed at thinning to different densities. So we'll be talking about pre-commercial thinning and adapting thinning strategies, again, for climate adaptation. And then King County Foresters will also show us some of the other management that they've been doing at Taylor Mountain. And then, relative to this presentation, on November 1st, we'll be taking people up into the Nisqually Community Forest to show them these snow gaps and the thinning we've done, and talk a little more broadly about the overall silvicultural strategy for the community forest, the past 5 years of thinning that we've wrapped up, and what our next 5-year plan is for harvesting. So October 26th, King County, Taylor Mountain, November 1st, Nisqually Community Forest in Ashford. And Alex just posted the announcement in the chat box there, so you can take a look at that. And with that, yeah, Bob, would love to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation. I'm just really excited about all the work you're doing in the community forest. One question, thinking long-term, how many snow gaps do you think it will take to really improve salmon habitat, low flows in the summer, in other words, to make a difference going into especially warmer climate?
Gosh, Bob, that's exactly why I asked for a phone meeting with you, because I'm hoping that you can tell me that.
We would love to work with you on that exact question. And yeah, it's amazing. The data that you're collecting are really hard to find anywhere. And so this is really moving the science forward. So it's aside from all the good work helping the community. And I'm just looking forward to the next several years. We're working with Bill's group on the Tulalip tribe, and asking some of the same questions, and often frustrated at how little data like this that there is.
Yeah, well, it's one of the exciting opportunities. I mean, both just being able to work with the Northwest Natural Resource Group, but also having a partner like the Nisqually Community Forest that's very open to experimentation. Is it gives us the ability to try out all different kinds of creative silvicultural techniques, and we remain very nimble in our thought process and open to people bringing us new ideas. So yeah, Bob, I'm really looking forward to talking with you a little more depth and seeing what some of the models might reveal and how that could guide our future timber harvesting.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, it's 8:31. I think out of the sake of being timely and getting people off to bed or wherever you go next, I think we will wrap it up. But thank you again for joining us for another Fireside Chat. These happen every month, so we do have one in November and the last one in December. We might continue next year. We don't have the topics picked out yet for the next 2 months. So if anybody has something of interest that you would like us to address, feel free to reach out to myself or Alex or Rowan, And we might draw your idea out of the hat and focus on that at the next Fireside chat. So again, thank you. And on behalf of the Northwest Natural Resource Group, I hope you all have a wonderful evening and look forward to seeing you at a future event.
Yeah, thanks all.
Good night.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Rowan.